if he is determined on regime change, and that means not just the removal of the supreme leader, which already happened. That means that you no longer have an Islamic Republic. You no longer have the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in charge of security, domestic and foreign. It's no longer in charge of almost 50% of the economy, which is the current situation. So that would be regime change. That would be absolutely dramatic. It would transform the Middle East. It would, especially if you had a new authority that came to power that was pro-American, and was cooperating with the Americans, it would transform also, at that point, you would have the United States in some form of control of a plurality of the world's oil supplies. Massively important in terms of thinking about things like the rivalry with China, all these kinds of things. So that would be absolutely dramatic. It is, a difficult proposition. It would be the best outcome if you could get that, and an orderly transition to a kind of democratic state that is authenticated by the Iranian people. There are many kind of versions in between where Donald Trump might say, we have changed the regime, and that you might still end up with the IRGC in control. That could be something that is very difficult for the U.S. to manage. It could be, very problematic for the region, low-level kind of conflict that continues for a long time in different forms, hybrid forms, etc. Or you could have some sort of Venezuela scenario, which you have essentially the old regime in place, but much more, compliant towards the U.S. We don't know, because he keeps saying that he wants all of those things. He has said, Venezuela is the perfect scenario, since this began at the weekend. He's been talking about Venezuela. He said that the Iranians want to talk to us, the new people, and he's also said that that we want the regime gone, and we're willing to go for 3-4 weeks or more of this campaign. So it's very difficult to say, because a lot depends on what Donald Trump decides is the moment at which he wants to declare victory.
Yeah, which is very interesting, isn't it? Because if there are no benchmarks by which to measure success, then it's impossible to say that in some ways the endeavour is a failure.
That's true, and you will have to wait, for some time. And if we think back, this is how it usually is. So, remember 2003. The statue of Saddam Hussein comes down in Baghdad. There's, jubilation in the streets. President George W. Bush declares mission accomplished, big banners, a real sense of sort of triumphalism amongst those who were proponents of the war. Some years later, many of the same people look back on that with, okay, that was a mistake. And there are, good reasons to think that, that decision to go into Iraq was not a success by any measure.
Or indeed Afghanistan, 20 years on, the attempted sort of change has effectively vanished.
Yeah. So the point being that it can take quite some time before you can definitively say, that was a win, that was a success, or that was a failure. Are we better off? Are we not better off? The one thing that one should say about, Iran is that this is a regime that is definitively, unpopular with its people, and has become both incapable of delivering domestically, and it has been for some time problematic for the region.
Yeah.
You could argue now that, it's the U.S. and Israel that are also, problematic for the region. Look at what the Gulf states, they didn't want this. Here we are with quite a lot of disruption, for their economies.
Yeah.